Hello, this is International Master Nigel Povar. It was my pleasure to take the top group at the Guildford Junior Club's junior section this particular Monday, and I decided this time to cover the theme of tactics, and I quoted the well-known saying by Richard Teichmann that chess is 99% tactics, and I thought in this session we would illustrate why tactics play such a critical part in a number of positions. And we started off with this very simple position where black is clearly winning with the significant material advantage, but white can save himself quite simply with one of the obvious tactics, and the juniors were asked, what do you think the move is, and they had absolutely no difficulty in finding the right move, which is c5 check. And as one of them very quickly pointed out, if king takes c5, then knight e4 check as a fork, like so, and we see that wins the queen. Or alternatively, if the queen takes on c5, then knight a4 check delivers the same outcome. So an extremely simple position and a bit of a warm-up for them, and then I went on to look at another position which comes from the same source, which is Gary Kasparov's masterclass on tactics, to illustrate and explain how important tactics are. This second position is much more difficult and quite interesting actually. We've got a rather strange sort of material situation where, well, not that strange, but fairly balanced, where black has a queen whereas white has a rook and bishop, and both sides have 3 pawns. But the position is rather unusual because in what is a relatively open board, the black queen is struggling somewhat for a number of decent squares, and I asked the kids, what move do you think white should play here? And much to my surprise and pleasure, they came up with the right move very quickly. So the right move is rook to a8, and obviously the black queen is attacked and cannot remain on the back rank, and she cannot capture the rook, obviously, because to take the rook would allow bishop to f3 check, skewering the king and queen. So it was also noted that if the queen goes to e6, there's a skewer with rook a6. If the queen goes to c4, there's a skewer with rook c8 check. And if the queen comes to d5, then bishop to f3 is a pin. So we're introducing both pins and skewers in this little illustration. The move queen to h7 is an option, but we'll come back to that in a moment, because the move that black can also play here is queen takes a2. And again, I asked the juniors, okay, what move now? But it didn't take them very long to spot that white can play rook takes a4. And the great thing about this move is that if queen takes a4, once again bishop e8 check is a deadly skewer. So after rook takes a4, note that the queen can't go to e6 again because of rook a6. Therefore the only move for the black queen, the only safe move, is all the way back to g8. And now white can play rook back to a8 again, and this time queen a2 is no longer an option. So now the queen is forced into h7, and I again asked the kids, what move does white play here? And once again it was really satisfying, very pleasing to see that they very quickly spotted the move bishop to g6. And we've got this incredible situation where the black queen is now trapped, and after queen takes rook a6 check, the position is quite clearly won for white. So these two examples illustrate the importance of tactics, albeit in these positions in endgame positions, but of course tactics are equally important in opening and middle game positions. So we're going to go on now to look at a couple of other positions that illustrate the importance of tactics. This position is one that I had in a game back in 2004 as white. I've gambited a pawn on f3, and at the moment I'm enjoying slightly better development, and it's black's move, and he could take on d4, although I would continue developing. So in this position he elected to play the move queen to e7, and here he's sort of trying to defend his king side and to be able to play perhaps g6 in a moment and put his bishop on g7. I castled, which is a fairly obvious way of continuing, and now my opponent played knight to c6, which brings another piece into play, and now he's threatening to capture my d-pawn on d4 with his knight with tempo. So I asked the kids, what do you do here? And a number of them sort of came up with various suggestions which weren't entirely suitable, but eventually one of them suggested the move that was played in the game, which is to play bishop takes h7. And this capture exploits the fact that the black king is somewhat exposed, and also the white diagonal from h5 to e8 is also sort of a source of attack for white. So in this position, black's got limited choices. First of all, let's look and see what happens if he takes the bishop on h7. Well, if he takes with the knight, we can immediately play queen h5 check, and really there's going to be no better move than king to d8 here. And after king to d8, knight to f7 check is going to win the rook on h8 and leaves the black king in a bad position, and white would enjoy a material advantage. So that isn't going to be helpful. So if instead rook takes h7, then white can play knight takes, and now if knight takes, queen h5 again, g6, queen takes check, king d8, and rook f7 will once again win material, because after the knight is captured on h7, we're going to find a situation where the white will be in exchange up, and the black king is still sort of struggling to get to safety, and he hasn't managed to develop his queen side. So instead of knight takes h7 here, maybe knight takes d4, attacking the queen on f3. But then, of course, in this position, white has very simply queen to d3. And this is a very comfortable position for white, who once again is an exchange to the good. So if we go back to the position after bishop takes h7, instead of capturing on h7 with either rook or knight, black chose in the game to play knight takes d4. I was now able to play bishop to g6 check, and again black's move is forced here, and now a very simple move by white, by me, was queen to d3, and in this position there's a fork now threatened on f7, knight f7 check, which would win the rook. So black moves his king, the knight goes into f7 anyway, and now black moved his rook off the unguarded square on h8 and puts it on what he considers a safe square on h4. But I said, what move does white play here? And it didn't again take them very long to spot queen g3 check, a simple fork which wins the rook. And after d6, queen takes h4, black resigned. So another example of how a fork and various tactics can help to see the quick execution and conclusion of a game. And we've got one more example coming up just after this. This final example illustrating tactical motifs is a game that I played in 1974 as white in the London Open against a very strong British player named Owen Hindle, who at the time had the equivalent sort of ELO of about a 2400 strength player, so very, very strong player. And the opening was one that a number of junior players are very familiar with. It's the Sicilian, and we get quite quickly on the board the dragon variation, which is very popular with many young players. Certainly was when I was younger, and I know many young players are quite keen on it even today, because it's got a very clear set of characteristics and principles, namely with white trying to attack on the king side against the fianchetto structure, and black attacking down the queen side against white's castled king on the queen side. And that's what we're going to see to some extent in this game. And the dragon variation was very popular in the 1960s and 70s. And as I say, this game was played back in 1974. So I continued with the standard move, bishop e3, and black fianchettos, completes the fianchetto. Now f3 is played, and this is the Yugoslav attack of the Sicilian dragon. It's the most aggressive variation. White secures his pawn structure with the pawn on e4, well protected and preventing knight to g4, and prepares to continue with his attack, as you'll see in the game. Black continues to develop. Queen to d2, a very standard move in this position, preparing to put the bishop in on h6 later on. Black castles, and now sometimes in this position white can elect to castle or throw his kingside pawns up immediately, but very popular, and probably the line that was most popular in the early days of the Yugoslav, is putting the bishop straight to c4, which is what I did in this game. Black now continues bishop to d7, again the usual move, and I now triple O'd, castling, standard. And in this position, black has several moves. The old move used to be queen a5 and then playing the rook from f8 to c8. But then at around the time of this game, rook to c8 and omitting queen a5 was a much more popular variation and remains the main line and most popular variation today. Now the bishop was attacked indirectly on c4 because of a potential knight capture on d4, so the bishop retreats to safety, and now black plays his knight to e5, and this is a very common position in the main line of the Yugoslav, and indeed on the database today there's well over 7,500 games played from this actual position, not to mention the countless club games that never make it onto the databases that would also have reached this position. So in this position I was quite familiar with this position back in 1974 when I got to this and played the standard move h4, and at the time there were a number of possible continuations here, but one that became quite popular then and remains popular today is to prevent the further advance of the h-pawn with h5. And this, is a bit of a disappointment for white, because he can't just carry on with his aggressive intentions. So people play moves like bishop to g5 then, and I tried that myself. But before this game I'd been looking at this line, and I prepared a novelty that I don't think anyone had played at that time, and it is knight to d5. On the database today there's about 30 games with this line, but when I played it in 1974 I don't think it had been played previously, certainly not in any published games. Now the purpose of this move is to try and eliminate black's knight on f6, which is a very important piece in helping to defend his king. Anyway, my opponent, Owen Hindle, obliged with capturing my knight, but it's pretty difficult for him to avoid the exchange of those knights, so I don't think there's anything wrong with this capture. I recaptured with the bishop, and now he continued with the standard plan of knight into c4 to force me to either take with the white squared bishop or to give up the black squared bishop. And in this situation it's most commonly the case that we retain the dark squared bishop in order to be able to attack the fianchetto structure, and that's exactly what I did. But before we continue, it's worth pointing out that probably better than knight c4 would have been e6, attacking the bishop, and after retreating black can sort of start his own advance on the queen side, and if I play say a3 then he can continue with b5, and black is certainly no worse in this position, it's probably quite equal. Alternatively he can go a5 straight away, and if I go a3 he can play b5, and again he hasn't yet played e6, but it's quite clear that black's initiative or activity on the queen side is probably more advanced than white's is on the king side, so I would say black is maybe fractionally better in this position. But as I say, at the time this position was new to my opponent, and so his knighting on c4 was quite an understandable move, because it's, as I say, the standard move in this position. I took, he recaptured, and now I throw up g4, which is the main point here. I've eliminated that knight from f6, so now I can play this. Even though it's going to lose a pawn, I'm not worried about that, because after the capture I played in the game h5. I ought to point out that rather than capturing, best would have been rook to a4, and after takes, rook takes, king b1, queen to a5, the threat of mate with rook a1 and the threat of the queen exchange sort of takes us into an ending like this, and this position is equal. You know, white has got some attacking chances on the king side. Black, though, has the bishop pair, and the f3 pawn could be in trouble, but then the g6 pawn's very weak, so the position's probably around equal. However, in the game, as I say, Owen captured on g4 and I played h5. And now Owen makes a serious mistake, one that looks, at the time of the game, you know, it looked quite a logical and reasonable move, but it certainly gives him some grave difficulties. He played g5, and the whole point of this is to try and prevent the h-file from being opened, prevent me from capturing on g6. He doesn't mind giving up a pawn, it's just he's trying to avoid the opening of the h-file. I can't take the pawn immediately, of course, because my knight on d4 would be hanging if I did. So I played h6, which attacks the bishop. It came to e5. And now I played b3, which is a good move because I'm forcing the rook away from the attack on the knight, which would then enable me to take on g5. So he dropped his rook back to c8. And I could have taken on g5, but then he would have played king to h7, blockading this pawn of mine on h6. So instead I flicked the check in first, which I think is the right thing to do, because it forces his king onto a black square. And as I've still retained my black square bishop, then his king is more susceptible than it would be if it sat on h7. So I took the pawn now, and he now makes a fatal mistake. The position's quite tense. If he played queen c7 here, after bishop takes e7, rook here, bishop back, f6, bishop back, queen to c3, this position would be fairly level, maybe slightly better for white, but nothing significant, and one could imagine that black could save the game and this would be a draw. But in this position, going back to this position, Owen made a serious mistake. He took on f3. Now I asked the kids, because up until now I'd asked them lots of questions like what's the opening, what moves do you play here, and they had a pretty good grasp of the opening. I was very impressed actually, and knew what some of the key motifs were. But in this particular position, I said, why do you think this capture on f3 is wrong? And I was delighted that one of the kids quickly jumped in and said it opens the g file, and that's exactly the reason that it's a mistake. Although Owen earlier was scared to open the h file, and you could argue that his king on h8 is safely sitting behind my h7 pawn, the opening of the g file proves to be a really serious mistake. Not immediately obvious, but it proves to be fatal, as this game nicely illustrates. So I played bishop to h6, attacking the rook. He played f2, and the purpose of this move is to prevent me putting a rook on g1 and using the g file. Now I asked the group again, should white take that rook on f8? And I was delighted that the general consensus was no. They weren't interested in the rook, and they're absolutely right. The white bishop on h6 is much more powerful than that rook on f8. It might only be worth 3 pawns and the rook worth 5 pawns, but it's about the activity of the pieces, and also the fact that the black squares are black's problem. The king is vulnerable on h8, but I need my black square bishop to be able to threaten it. So to take the rook would be a grave mistake. I didn't give any consideration to that here, to be honest, and I quite quickly took off this pawn. Owen now played queen to b6, and he's trying to put pressure on the knight on d4 and tie me down, and he's pinning the knight, of course, to my own queen. And now I found a nice move, but it wasn't the best move, but it's similar to what the best move would have achieved. I won't mention that in the moment because it'll confuse or spoil the flow of the game. I played this rather unobvious move, queen to g1, and this maintains the defence on my knight, but it has a threat, and a very powerful threat. And so let me illustrate. If, for example, black goes ahead and plays queen to c5 with the intention of playing bishop takes d4 followed by queen takes c2 mate, white delivers a crushing mate with queen g8 check. Black takes with the rook, check, and now if rook takes, bishop f8 check is going to be mate after black has given up pieces on h2, h3, h5, and that's mate. So that wouldn't work. That's rook takes g8. So instead of rook takes g8, king takes g8, of course. But now rook check, and there's only one decent move here, because obviously if the king goes back to the h file, then bishop f8 would deliver mate. So bishop to g7, and now the rook captures. Now clearly king f8 would get mated like that. So the king goes to h8, and now very simply the rook retreat, and there's no defence to this mate. So that's what would have happened if queen c5. So the threat of queen g8 check is the reason I played queen g1. So a very powerful mate. But after my queen g1, and my opponent, I say, is a very talented player, Owen Hindle, he realised quite quickly what the threat was, and he found the only defence, f5. And this provides an escape route for the black king from g8 to f7. So none of the variations with queen g8 would now work. However, I found I knew what was the key idea here. It was still to sort of engineer an attack with use of the g8 square, and so I played rook to d2, and he played bishop takes knight on d4, and now the key move, which again I asked the group to find, and they did find it, I'm pleased to say, rook to g2. And in this position black has no defence to the mate that will follow from rook g8 check. For example, if black plays queen to d8, we go rook check, rook takes, we take with the pawn, this is the key, we always take with the pawn promoting, he takes back, and bishop g7 double check, mate. And there's just no escaping that particular mating attack. So going back to this position after my rook to g2, Owen played bishop b2 check, and after I took with the king, he simply resigned. Note, he cannot play queen takes g1 because of bishop to g7 with mate. And the same was true, by the way, if we go back to this position, that after my rook g2, he couldn't play bishop takes g1 because again bishop g7 is mate. So this game won the Brilliancy Prize for the tournament. It was widely published in a number of magazines, and most pleasingly for me it was also published in the Russian magazine 64, the Russian weekly magazine. So I must say this was one of my most exciting victories, and when you consider it was played in a weekend Swiss tournament where the rate of play is quite quick, I was quite pleased to find some fairly key moves. But this illustrates the power of a mating attack and some of the motifs of skewers and pins and forks that occur within this game and the other games I've shown you. So I hope you find these examples useful, and I hope they help to reinforce that view that chess really is all about 99% tactics. Thank you.